Hello and welcome. I'm Valerie Paley, Senior Vice President and Sue Ann Weinberg, Director of the Patricia D. Klingenstein Library at the New York Historical Society. Before we begin, I'd like to thank Louise Muir, our President and CEO, Pam Schaffler, Chair of the Board of Trustees, all of our trustees, Joyce B. Cowan, Diane Max, and the late Adam Max, and the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, along with our Chairman's Council, our members, and our many other generous donors. None of the work of New York Historical is possible without your continued and committed support. Now, as many of you know, we launched the Center for Women's History in early 2017. It is the first initiative of its kind in the nation within the walls of a major museum. Now, even during this challenging time of the COVID-19 pandemic, we remain committed to exploring the lives and legacies of women who have shaped and continue to shape the American experience. Which brings me to today's program, Litigating Equality, Ruth Bader Ginsburg's Fight to Expand Civil Liberties. We'll be presenting a series of programs which will air over the course of our related exhibition, Notorious RBG, The Life and Times of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Thank you to the exhibition's lead sponsor, Weil, Gotshal and Magis, the Weil Philanthropic Committee and Social Responsibility and Foundation team. I would also like to acknowledge the exhibition's major sponsor, Northern Trust. And now I'm honored to introduce today's speakers. Brenda Feigen is a graduate of Vassar College and Harvard Law School. She co-founded and directed the ACLU's Women's Rights Project with Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She also was National Vice President of NOW for Legislation and a co-founder of both the National Women's Political Caucus and of Ms. Magazine. Ms. Feigen is depicted as one of 5 women's movement leaders in Hulu's Emmy Award-winning limited series Mrs. America, and is featured in the Academy Award-nominated and Emmy-winning documentary RBG. A conversation between Brenda and the actor portraying her in Mrs. America was published last summer by New York Magazine's The Cut. Ms. Feigen has written tributes to the late Justice Ginsburg that appear in the Harvard Law Review and in the Columbia Law Review. While Justice Ginsburg was still alive, Ms. Feigen's article, The ACLU, Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Me, was published in the ACLU magazine. Ms. Feigen is admitted to practice in Massachusetts, New York, and California, and is now co-counsel with the ACLU in a large class action lawsuit on behalf of pregnant and lactating dock workers. Nadine Strossen has written, taught, and advocated extensively in the areas of constitutional law and civil liberties, including through frequent media interviews. From 1991 to 2008, she served as president of the American Civil Liberties Union, the first woman to head the nation's largest and oldest civil liberties organization. Professor Strossen is currently a member of the ACLU's National Advisory Council, as well as the advisory boards of Electronic Privacy Information Center, EPIC, Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, FIRE, Heterodox Academy, and the National Coalition Against Censorship. When she stepped down as ACLU president in 2008, 3 Supreme Court justices participated in her farewell and tribute luncheon: Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Antonin Scalia, and David Souter. Her 2018 book, Hate: Why We Should Resist It with Free Speech, Not Censorship, has been widely praised by ideologically diverse experts. Her earlier book, Defending Pornography, Free Speech, Sex, and the Fight for Women's Rights, was named by the New York Times as a notable book of 1995. The National Law Journal has named Strossen one of America's 100 most influential lawyers, and several other publications have named her one of the country's most influential women. Our moderator, Irin Carmon, is senior correspondent at New York Magazine, a CNN contributor, and co-author of Notorious RBG, The Life and Times of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, which spent 3 months on the Times bestseller list. She's been a national reporter at MSNBC and NBC News, as well as a staff writer at Salon.com and Jezebel.com, covering gender, reproductive rights, and the law. As a contributing writer to the Washington Post's Outlook section, she won a 2018 Mirror Award from the Newhouse School at Syracuse University for her work breaking the story of sexual harassment allegations against Charlie Rose. She speaks frequently across the country on women's leadership and rights. Welcome, Nadine, Brenda, and Erin.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Good evening, everybody. I'm Irin Carmon, co-author of Notorious RBG, and it is my distinct honor to be in conversation this evening with 2 giants of the law, who know a thing or two about litigating equality and whose work intersected significantly with that of Justice Ginsburg. And of course, we're going to talk a lot more about that. And I think it's so fitting that this conversation about litigating equality takes place with two individuals who made history at the ACLU. As co-founder of the Women's Rights Project, as Valerie mentioned, as the first woman to serve as president. We'll talk more about RBG's time at the ACLU specifically, but I always found it very striking and important that regardless of RBG's reputation, occasionally as a moderate and a consensus seeker, she always was incredibly proud of her affiliation with the ACLU. In fact, she called it the most rewarding association I have ever known. That was during the 1970s in a letter to Polly Murray. And it was really important to her to advance equality in a general interest organization. So we will have so much more to say about this, but I do want to start out, of course, we have these illustrious bios that we heard about from Valerie, but I want to get deeper into the trajectories of each one of you, how you intersected with RBG, but also your own, to borrow an RBG phrase, path marking. Brenda, let's start with you.
Okay. I'm going to start way back, if it's okay with you. I want to set the stage for what we're talking about. And I am going way back. I'm going back to 1873, when Myra Bradwell was trying to become a lawyer in the state of Illinois. They had a law that said that women could not be lawyers. She appealed to the Supreme Court of the United States, and the court said that it was neither a privilege nor a right for her to become a lawyer. Now we go forward to, forgive the skipping a lot here, 1961, when Mrs. Hoyt was accused of killing her husband, and she was tried and found guilty of murder. She appealed to the Supreme Court of the United States, and the court said, no, you do not have a right to have any other women on the jury. She thought women would be more sympathetic to her plight as an abused wife. That was 1961. 1968, I was a student at Harvard Law School studying constitutional law with the most eminent of all of them, Paul Freund. And the case we were talking about that particular day was Gessert against Cleary, which was a case that involved Michigan barmaids who were not allowed to work in bars unless their husbands or brothers were present when they were working. And Freund thought that was kind of a good, funny case, and he made just a big joke out of it. I stood up and said, this is not funny. It's a violation of the Constitution. I was furious. He made a laughing stock out of me. And that really was the moment when I turned into a radical feminist. I was furious. Tears of rage actually running out of the door of that classroom.
We all have to be grateful to Paul Freund.
Oh, Paul Freund. 1970, I'm just skipping.
A man who RBG admired immensely, by the way.
Oh, well, but wait a minute. I'm gonna help with that in a second to get to that. She didn't know, but I knew, because I'm gonna skip back to 1970 for a minute. 1970, we saw, well, first of all, I was vice president of NOW, and I was organizing the protest and money for the Senate, and I was working for ratification and running around the country debating the noxious Phyllis Schlafly, who was depicted on Mrs. America. You may have noticed that with me debating her. That was one thing in 1970. The next thing was when the women's movement was organizing, and we were allowed to have half of Fifth Avenue for the big, huge women's march celebrating the 50th anniversary of suffrage. And we took over the whole avenue. But really important also in that year was Ruth, I call her Ruth. Ruth and her husband Marty had a case that they were taking with the ACLU to the 10th Circuit that involved Mr. Moritz, who lived with his elderly mother. He was a traveling salesman, and he needed to go out to work occasionally, and he wanted to have a caretaker, and he got a caretaker, and then he deducted $600, which is given to women who take care of their elderly parents or children or whatever. He was not allowed that, and Ruth and Marty took the case with the ACLU. They succeeded in the 10th Circuit. But the interesting thing was that Dean Erwin Griswold from Harvard Law School wrote a brief as a Solicitor General against Ruth and Marty, supporting the deduction only going to women, and attached to that brief an appendix, which he called Appendix A, that listed all of the statutes that discriminate on the basis of gender in the US Code. Now what happened was that Sally Reed, I'm now immediately getting to Ruth. Sally Reed.
I'll stop you and say that for anybody who has heard the story about RBG as a law student or who's seen it depicted in film, RBG as a law student being asked to justify her place, taking the place of a man at law school. That was the same Erwin Griswold who then goes ahead and hands her this list of laws that need to be.
That's exactly right. Handed the court. He lost, they won. And now in 1971, or actually 71, Sally Reed comes along. Sally Reed is a woman who was divorced from her husband and their son committed suicide. She wanted to administer the estate of the son. And Idaho had a law that said that males are preferred over women for administering estates. So she was taking her case to the Supreme Court when Ruth and the ACLU heard about it, found out about it, and that Ruth ended up writing the brief for Sally Reed, which was in 1971, the first case that the United States Supreme Court held violated women's equal protection rights. They had never, ever thought there was such a thing before. So that's 1971. I got a call sort of shortly thereafter. I was starting Ms. Magazine with Gloria Steinem, and I got a call from Mel Wolf at the ACLU, legal director, saying, we're starting a women's rights project. Professor Ginsburg is directing it. Would you like to come on and direct it with her? And I said, gee, I just started this magazine. I don't know. Anyway, it took me 3 weeks to decide that I should accept that offer, which I did. And that was when I met Ruth. And that was the beginning of a whole new chapter that really, I'm just skipping to the big case that came our way that spring. We started in January. In the spring, Sharon Frontiero, an Air Force lieutenant, had a husband, and she wanted to get housing and medical benefits for him that were equal to what male officers were getting for their wives. She was an Air Force lieutenant. She wanted those benefits for her husband. She had been denied them in a lower court, and now Sharon Frontiero, represented by Joe Levin at the Southern Poverty Law Center, was on her way to the Supreme Court. When Ruth heard that, she said, oh, we have to get into this. So we wrote an amicus brief that was really a formative experience in my life, just being there with her, writing that, working. And I want to tell you what, she didn't just cite laws and anything in the Constitution. I mean, she was talking about the 14th Amendment, of course, and we wanted Sharon to get equal protection. But she also went back to Thomas Jefferson, who said in the brief, were our state a pure democracy, there would still be excluded from our deliberations women. Ibsen said something that's an exclusively male society. Ruth also included in that our brief, Elizabeth Cady Stanton's statement from the Declaration of Sentiments that she gave in 1848 in Seneca Falls. And she said, Elizabeth said, the history of mankind, this is in our brief to the court, is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations on the part of man toward women, having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her. He has endeavored in every way that he could to destroy her confidence in her own powers, to lessen her self-respect, and to make her willing to lead an independent and abject life. And she talked about the Gessert case, Paul Freund's case, that he was defending and making a joke out of me in opposing it. We got near the argument for the court because there was our brief. We were asked to do the reply brief because our brief was so good. And now it was time to figure out what we're going to do about the oral argument, because Joe Levin was nowhere near a match for Ruth. So I called Joe Levin myself and I said, Joe, we've got to get some time for Ruth. And he gave me 12 minutes for Ruth to argue the Frontiero case in the Supreme Court. And so as that approached, and I was shuffling around getting all my big case books to give her cites for the cases she would be referring to in the oral in her 12 minutes. I had all these huge case books. We were on our way to the court. We got to the front door and the marshals opened the doors and led us through the corridors of the court, which are lined, as you both probably know, by a huge bus of old white males that were big deals in the Supreme Court in our history. The argument itself was stunning. She probably heard it. She was brilliant. She didn't pause. None of the justices asked a single question or made a single comment, which is extremely unusual. And I just want to say one thing while I'm here. That year, 1973, when Ruth was arguing that case, was exactly 100 years after Myra Bradwell had been told by the state of Illinois that she did not have a right to practice law, and affirmed in that position by the Supreme Court of the United States. So there they were, stunned and amazed by her. The result of that was that we won on the merits of the case. They could not just give benefits to wives and not to husbands, but we did not get what we really wanted, which was a very strict level of scrutiny that Ruth had been pushing for in our brief. We really, really wanted to have sex discrimination viewed as harshly as race discrimination. We got a plurality of the court, led by Justice Brennan, to agree with us, basically quoting a lot from our brief in his plurality opinion. Justice Powell and 2 other justices decided, no, we're going to wait and see what happens with equal rights amendment. We're not going to give you that high standard of review. The rest, we don't need to worry about. Rehnquist, of course, dissented. And so we won on the merits, but I feel, like it's important to know that that was the beginning of Ruth's sex discrimination work in the Supreme Court. She, after that, took some cases on behalf of men that she considered to be a double-edged sword. One notable one was a father whose wife had died in childbirth, and she left him with a baby son, and he wanted to get the Social Security benefits that were given automatically to wives of husbands, and she couldn't get it. And the bottom line was that he fought, and Ruth got a 9-zip opinion on our side saying that's sex discrimination. So against men, against women, it's all about the same. I have a lot more, Erin, to go into here, but I don't want to keep yammering. There's so much more we did, like
follow-up questions, but I do want to say, for anybody who has not yet heard Justice Ginsburg arguing Frontiero, the audio is available online. You can listen to it at oyez.org, where they have all of the arguments. You can also hear it at the New York Historical Society, where there's a special section. If you watch the documentary about RBG, you can hear that is the one in which she quotes Sarah Grimke and says, "We ask no special favor from our brethren. All we ask is that they take their feet off our necks." Very memorable. Again, the paradox of RBG being that she could boldly stand in front of 9 male justices and effectively tell them to take their feet off her neck, while also appearing as sort of, married, white, middle-class, Harvard-educated, polite, didn't even correct them when they got her name wrong and called her Mrs. Ginsburg instead of, Ms. Ginsburg. So one of the fascinating things I think about Justice Ginsburg is the ways in which she was kind of a bomb thrower and the ways in which she was a moderate consensus, or maybe an institutionalist is a better way to say it. We will have a lot more to say about it, but I think you set the stage beautifully, Brenda, because the work that you did together and then throughout the 1970s that continued with the Women's Rights Project, managed to, even if it did not go quite as far as Justice Ginsburg or Ruth would have wished, still managed to overturn, as you say, a century of precedent for the non-lawyers in the room, and I am one of them, the upshot of it was to say that women too were equal in the eyes of the Constitution, that the government could not pass laws that discriminated on the basis of sex using the rationale that they were just protecting women. Absolutely. They were putting them on this pedestal, and this was another quote that she referred to in that case, right? The pedestal is actually a cage. Now,
let me just say one thing. I have to tell you something. You're mentioning, and I don't want to interrupt you. I just want to say that we were asked after that decision to do a study for the United States Commission on Civil Rights that would lay out all of the federal statutes that distinguish and discriminate against women. We used Griswold's Appendix A from the Moritz case to demonstrate that, and Ruth used her class at Columbia, now she's a professor at Columbia Law School, to help us with that. It was just mind-blowing how much there was and how clearly she laid it out, really. Anyway, I apologize for interrupting, but I just want to.
No, there's literally nothing to apologize for. Nadine, now that we've set the stage sort of through the 1970s, so 1980, RBG gets nominated by Carter to the DC Circuit, eventually ascends to the Supreme Court. I'm wondering, first tell us about, briefly, because I know that it is a deep and rich story, but about your trajectory at the ACLU and what it was like to sort of come in knowing about this legacy and then how you intersected with RBG.
The two stories really converge, and thank you, Brenda, for that really fascinating background. And I highly recommend to everybody who hasn't yet read it, your 2 articles. I had gone to law school slightly after Brenda. I started in 1972, but she was already a legend there, by the way. as was RBG, I guess then just called Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She was a guest speaker at Harvard Law School when I was a first-year student. Now, one of my big passions in life was women's rights, and another one was reproductive freedom. I was very involved in both movements, starting when I was in high school and became more active when I was in college. I was very excited about a then new course about women and the law. It was brand new at Harvard Law School, introduced as a result of demands by some women law students. And to the opportunity to meet Ruth Bader Ginsburg and hear her speak, it just made such a huge impression on me. I have an absolute visual memory because, as I've told her many times, and we became on a first name basis, so I'll also call her Ruth. As I told her many times, I remembered not only what she said and what she said about the link between women's rights and civil liberties and the ACLU, that really planted a seed that grew in my mind to make the ACLU the preeminent beneficiary of my efforts as a lawyer and as a crusader for human rights, including women's rights. But I also remember exactly what she was wearing, exactly what
okay, tell us, because she had an incredible sense of
it was so elegant. I don't think I had ever even seen that kind of outfit before. So I would call it a jacket dress. It was a dress that had, the skirt had a solid black. The shirt part of the dress was black and white with a really beautiful abstract pattern that looked kind of like birds, but it was abstract. It looked very Asian. And then there was a black jacket, and it was, I mean, the internet didn't exist then, but I tried to find something that looked just like it. And I have to say that when I became the first ACLU female president, before that I had been general counsel, and I do believe that Ruth was the first female to be general counsel, which is right below president of the ACLU. So I was very, very proud to follow in her footsteps. When I became the national president, I had never met her. I was just one of, hundreds and hundreds of students in that audience. She, out of the blue, sent me the most cordial note, signed it with her first name, made herself completely available. And I came to understand that that was something that she did just astoundingly.
And at that point, what role was she serving in?
She was then a judge on the DC Circuit Court of Appeals, right? It was before she had been nominated for the United States Supreme Court, but that was still, I mean, she was a legend because of the work she had done as a lawyer, and also making history as a very influential judge at the circuit court level. And so I've been, one of the things that always fascinated me was why she had chosen the ACLU as the locus of her focus for women's rights. And as I say, that definitely influenced me.
Did you ever get a chance to ask her about it?
I did. I've many times in private, but also in February of 2018, at her request, I conducted a public interview of her at New York Law School. And I asked her that question, Irin, and I've got in front of myself now the portion of the transcript in which she answered. She said, I thought about what group I might affiliate with, and I thought about the National Organization for Women and the Women's Equity Action League. And that it came to me that if women's rights ought to be high on the human rights agenda, men had to be part of the operation too. And the ACLU being the foremost protector of civil liberties, it seemed the right place. In other conversations I had with her, and I've seen this quoted publicly as well, she talked about women's rights getting more respect and also logically being part of an overall human rights agenda. She has also said that she thought the quality of lawyering at the ACLU was extraordinarily high, and that the ACLU had an excellent reputation before the Supreme Court and other courts. So she wanted to take advantage of that as well.
Brenda, I'm wondering, having both worked in, organizations like NOW and Ms. that are very proudly founded by and for women and feminist women in particular, how do you see, there's that trade-off, right? Which is that we talked about this. I did a little oral history for our office issue at New York Magazine, where I talked to you, Brenda, and a few others about what it was like to found the Women's Rights Project just from the point of view of the everyday workplace. Several of the female lawyers that I talked to told me that they found out that they were being paid less than men. This was the 1970s. So Brenda, how do you view it in terms of making that decision about whether to work at a distinguished legacy organization in which there are many different interests versus working at a female-centric or feminist-centric one when it came to the kind of work that you guys were doing, that you were doing in the 1970s?
Well, I think what you mean, but female-centric doesn't include the Women's Rights Project, right? Because that's not what that was, I just, as a symbol of that, when we started, I went and got a big yellow sign that said women working and plastered it on our glass door that separated us from the rest of the office. That's not exactly your question. I loved working in both NOW and Ms. for the 1 minute that I was there, because we were just starting it. I think that the opportunity at the ACLU to do so many different kinds of things, I couldn't have done anywhere else. I mean, the fact, for example, that when Roe v. Wade was decided, which was not our case, and which Ruth did not like the way that decision was written. And we started a reproductive freedom rights project that was sort of within the Women's Rights Project. And I had these pretty major forced sterilization cases that came up from North Carolina as well as from Georgia. I wouldn't have had the resources to do that in any other organization, but the problem with those cases was the statute was deemed to have run, statute of limitations was deemed to have run, and we got thrown out of court, even though we were working with the Southern office. And only 2-3 years ago were the people of North Carolina who had been sterilized without their consent given $50,000 each as reparations, which is not your question, but it's just that you have.
No, I think this is so important because I actually, we included the case in Notorious RBG because the arguments that you and later Justice Ginsburg made in that case were what we would today consider intersectional. You were saying that these individuals were being sterilized because they were in some cases single mothers or Black women.
Both.
And all of these intersected in so many of them. And in fact, last I checked, at least when we were working on Notorious RBG, the plaintiff in that case, now Ruth Cox, is still alive.
No, she's no longer alive. Her daughter is alive. I mean, she was sad. She took a Greyhound bus.
This forcible sterilization. So go ahead.
She took a Greyhound bus from North Carolina up to Long Island, went into our affiliate office there. They sent her to me in the national office. And I want to remind you, when the National Women's Rights Project had 140 lawyers in different offices around the country working with us. So it wasn't just the two of us sitting there by ourselves. Anyway, she came and I was very interested in her case. She handed me this little tiny piece of paper. It said bilateral tubal ligation on it. And I told her what it meant, which she had a hunch it did mean. And we went to court in North Carolina with our Southern office, but as I said, that didn't really work out. I mean, the problem with Roe, if I can just segue to that for 1 second, with.
Can I say one other thing about the ACLU before you get
yeah.
Brenda, because you mentioned the an affiliate, and that's another factor that Ruth always stressed as to one of the reasons why she chose to work with the ACLU. In addition to national offices, the ACLU also has state-based, what we call affiliates, and now it's in every state. I think it was in almost every state even back then, and those become feeders for really promising cases in terms of sympathetic factual situations, sympathetic plaintiffs, right, that can present a compelling opportunity to raise the legal arguments that you were seeking to make and to build the law in the direction that you want.
And to strategize in a way, which brings us back to strategize in a way that RBG felt that Roe was not part of.
Right, right.
To kind of get everybody in line on the same strategy, which was a big part of what she's so famous
right.
for.
Yeah, there are two things. One is Roe, which but before we leave the affiliates, there was a national convention of lawyers for the ACLU that Ruth and I went to and gave our presentation about the Women's Rights Project. And at the end of that, we went outside because it was a gorgeous day in Boulder, Colorado. And I said, gee, I wish I could go riding. And she said, oh, I'd love to go riding. And I found a place to ride and we rode, and she was a fantastic horseback rider. Both of us had grown up on English saddles, but we ended up on Western saddles. So that was wonderful. And we met all the people at the different affiliates, and it was great. Back to Roe for 1 second, the problem that Ruth had up until the day she died was that if only that case had been decided on equality principles rather than on privacy and liberty, and therefore viability, which we're running smack dab into right now with these horrible states that are doing things to it, like Texas and Mississippi. She felt that if men could control their reproductive system, so should women be able to. And we didn't do it that way. So Roe was a problem, and it presented itself in a number of different ways.
Right. I do want to go back for a second to RBG's relationship with the ACLU and civil liberties in general, because, as important and as core as her women's rights work was, what has always been really interesting to me is that what made her want to be a lawyer in the first place, by her own account, was watching McCarthyism in action, right? Hitting her own community, whether Cornell or in Brooklyn, and she knew people who were being targeted by Joseph McCarthy. She talked about working for a government professor at Cornell who pointed out to her that it was lawyers who were standing up for the First Amendment. And I think that this is one moment in which her commitment to the First Amendment was profoundly shaped, that she would continue that commitment throughout her life. And at the same time, she'd grown up in a lower middle class to working class household and suffered financial loss when her mother died. And so she said it was a way you could do something good for the world and also have a profession, a very practical approach too. But again, it was civil liberties writ large, I think, that brought her to the law in the first place. And Nadine, I do want to ask you, because I have always been really interested and amused by the fact that when RBG was up for the US Supreme Court, an individual named Ron Klain, now chief of staff to President Biden, was in charge of getting her confirmed. I was a junior level functionary in the Clinton White House, and wrote a memo, which he personally told me he's very embarrassed by, and that he wrote RBG an apology note that she didn't respond to, I think. Wow. After it was released to the public from the Clinton files. And in this memo, Ron Klain complains that, in some ways he is anticipating what the Republicans, the Senate Judiciary Committee, and the General Senate will say about RBG and her career. And in some ways, he's being really frustrated. He said that this came about because he was actually having these long sessions with RBG and walking through the hallways. And I think he saw David Gergen, and he was like, how's it going? And he said, it's going really badly. And he said, write a memo. And so this memo, in which he, I just want to quote from one part of it here. When asked about her support for ACLU policies to legalize prostitution, decriminalize the distribution of pornography to minors, decriminalize marijuana, and ban the death penalty, Justice Ginsburg has a strong tendency to defend the ACLU position. This is hilarious. He obviously went to find the most controversial things he could. And then RBG recalled this exact time very similarly, but she said, I said, stop, because I will not do anything to disparage the ACLU. And so they grudgingly gave up. Now, many people are only familiar with certain parts of the ACLU's work and legacy, but it is perhaps the ones like defending the Nazis' right to march in Skokie, First Amendment wise. Perhaps it is the laundry list that Ron Klain made. RBG did not back down either from her support of abortion rights or from her work at the ACLU. Nadine, I'm curious, what was your insight into RBG's posture about some of the ACLU's other equality work?
think first I have to put this in historical context, Erin, because I think the ACLU now has a lot more support and sympathy nationwide. It certainly has many, many more members and many more contributors. But back at this time, it was very controversial. This was just relatively soon after the 1988 presidential election, when Michael Dukakis, who was the Democratic candidate, was beaten up for being a card-carrying member of the ACLU, invoking McCarthyism. That was how he was attacked by George Herbert Walker Bush. Bill Clinton definitely was moving the party to the center, wanted to run away from any association with the L word, by which I mean liberal, certainly including the ACLU. The Clinton administration took a lot of policy positions that were inconsistent with the ACLU. And so there was no love lost between them and the ACLU. I remember Rahm Emanuel was his chief of staff, and he was quoted in the New Yorker magazine as saying, I hear that, the ACLU is criticizing me. Well, we wear that criticism like a badge of honor. So it's really quite extraordinary that Clinton would even nominate her, let alone that she would get confirmed with almost no negative votes. And by the way, when you talk about the controversial issues, of the 3 people who voted against her, all conservative Republicans, and 3 nay votes is nothing by today's standards, right? And then there was a 4th, Jesse Helms, who was not present, but said that he would have voted against her not only because of her stance on abortion, but she probably supports the ACLU's homosexual agenda. So let's throw that in there too.
Turned out to be true.
But all of these positions, which have now become mainstream, would not be touched even by Democrats at the time. You have to understand that everybody was in favor of the death penalty, including Bill Clinton, right? And there was a war.
How do you think it happened? How did she manage to sort of sneak?
I asked her that. Again, most recently in this public interview in 2018, and she seemed to agree that she probably would not have been even nominated in the subsequent era. I mean, it's certainly now, but even going back, that well, first of all, she when she answered the question, she provided a little bit of history. She pointed out that Nino Scalia had 0 negative votes. He was confirmed unanimously in, I think it was 1987. And so she had 3 negative votes. Breyer, I think, also had almost no negative votes at all. But then it changed. After that, there started to be party line votes. And I think that, the president would have been foolhardy in that climate to think that he could or she could successfully nominate somebody who was so associated with an organization that was so controversial. But she said to me, and again, this is from the transcript of our interview, there was nothing that you could do that would lead me to speak of the ACLU in any but the most praiseworthy terms. And I'd like to make one other point on this theme, Erin and Brenda, and that is, even at the time, I think a lot of people were very pleasantly surprised. Not only that there were so few votes against her, but she was not even asked a single question during the confirmation hearings about her association with the ACLU or the work that the ACLU had done, despite the fact that we had to produce like every single minute of every single meeting of the board or of general counsel in which she had participated. And I'm sure she would have answered brilliantly, right? But she never was given the chance.
Right, so the wrong thing was wrong.
Yeah, exactly.
I asked about, decriminalizing pornography distribution to minors, as it turned out.
Yeah. Well,
but I think it was luck also because, looking back when I was researching Notorious RBG, there had been a series of debacles of nominations. And this was sort of one who she was already on the DC circuit. She had had about a decade of seeming like a moderate. They played up her friendship with Scalia. Ironically, you were going to make one more point, then I want to go to Brenda on something, which is that you talked about her critique of Roe. There also had to be a kind of assuaging of the fears of feminists about RBG. I think people forget. But Nadine, what were you going to say?
Just a little bit of humor. Calvin Trillin, who wrote for The Nation magazine and did a little ditty about, he was also flabbergasted about this non-controversial sailing through, and especially recalling how Dukakis had gotten beaten up about the ACLU just for being a member. I mean, which was nothing compared to Ruth's level of involvement. So in this little ditty, he said, somehow all the White House vetters remained unmoved by those 4 letters that spooked Dukakis through and through, the dread quartet, ACLU. The paths in women's law she plowed were plowed while working for this crowd. Republicans don't seem annoyed to hear the judge was thus employed. They cheer she made some law impartial and got compared to Thurgood Marshall.
That's amazing. I've actually never heard that before, and I really like it. Brenda, what do you remember from that time in terms of being recruited and investigated as part of RBG's, storied past at the ACLU, in some ways feared past?
I'm not sure what you mean. There are 2 things I want to talk about, but I'll answer you as best I can by saying that I did have an FBI, a CIA file, I found out, but I don't know how the years combined. I just know that I asked for it and got it. And I was representing a number of other rather well-known feminists and found theirs as well. So, I mean,
there's Marty ended up recruiting letters from feminists when RBG's critique of Roe v. Wade came out. So I'm curious, were you involved in the mix in terms of comforting or sort of giving reassurances to feminists who were worried that RBG or the friendship with Scalia, the critique of Roe v. Wade, that she wouldn't be feminist enough?
Absolutely. First of all, her friendship, as far as I'm concerned, as I said in RBG, I think that was ridiculous. I mean, I disagree that you should just be buddies with reactionary people. And I've said that to her. I don't have friends like that, but he's a brilliant man. And I know I'm in the minority on that. Can I just change the topic only slightly to point out that in the marriage cases, when Kennedy wrote the brilliant decision in favor of same-sex marriage, we were visiting Ruth and in her chambers, and she said to me, Brenda, if he hadn't included a page on equality, if he had just left it privacy and liberty, I would have had to have written a concurring opinion, which she didn't like to do. She liked to be in the majority or in the dissent. But I just think that, she was always willing to stand up for her own views. And when if anybody tried with me to say that you're just an equalist feminist, which was one of the 3 themes that was going on in the early 70s, or you're not a cultural feminist, or you're not a difference feminist like Carol Gilligan, I don't buy that stuff. I mean, Ruth and I, we're paving the way for women to have equality in this country. And all of these little fights along the way were just that, and we won them, and here we were. But on the other hand, I just want to mention 2 cases that you may remember. One of them, of course, was the Hobby Lobby case, and we're talking about religion, with Ruth in passionate dissent about the fact that a mom and pop business would be assumed to have a religion that would be violated if they did whatever they didn't believe in. And I mean, that as well, so what that meant was they were not getting contraceptives for their female employees because they didn't believe in contraceptives. And the majority of the court said, that's okay, they have a religion. I don't think corporations have a religion, neither did she, and her dissent in that case is brilliant in the Hobby Lobby case.
And it was more than a mom and pop store. It was a nationwide corporation.
You're right. But it was, it wasn't AT&T. I mean, it was a very significant dissent on her part. The other significant dissent that had a lot to do with women was the Carhart case, which had to do with what they're calling partial birth abortions, late-term abortions. And she vehemently defied the rest of the court, the majority of the court, to say this is a women's issue, and you can't take away the right of a woman and her doctor to decide what's best for her. So, I mean, I just think it's really important to focus on those kinds of things. As I said, I mean, she said to me, we have to have equality, and those cases basically deny women the equality of determining how their bodies will be helped and healed and treated by doctors. It was a passionate feeling. And I also and to go back to your point, feel very strongly that what motivated her was equality, equity, justice, and all these shifts within these organizations, and women criticizing it was easy to slap them down, very frankly.
You know, what many people don't know about Roe is that not only was it based on a privacy, the term for lawyers is substantive due process, but it actually had in two places language that was antithetical to women's autonomy and humanity. You know, I always ask my students after they read Roe versus Wade, well, whose right was the Supreme Court protecting? Oh, a woman's right to choose. Oh, really? Show me the language. And in both passages in Blackmun's opinion, where he defines the right, he defines it as the right of the doctor.
Yes, and the doctor. That's right.
And then he uses to add insult to injury, he uses the male pronoun, right, regarding his patient. It's never described as the woman's right.
Well, and that was actually precisely, that was a portion of RBG's critique of Roe. But Nadine, I do want to, in the time that we have left, I also want to ask you, Brenda flagged some of the Supreme Court cases, unfortunately, mainly dissents, in which RBG really distinguished herself as continuing to carry the torch for gender equality. What jumps out to you in terms of Justice Ginsburg's legacy on the bench?
Well, I think it's just such poetic justice that finally from the other side of the bench, she got to take the step that she and Brenda almost took in Frontiero, like 2 decades earlier, when as a fairly junior justice, she wrote an eloquent opinion in the VMI case that all but treated gender classifications as presumptively unconstitutional as racial classifications. And so that was clearly a major legacy, which is continuing to have great reverberations. And I think she also carried forward her civil libertarian legacy because she was a strong defender of First Amendment freedoms, not only freedom of speech, but she, by the end, was one of the few defenders of what was usually called separation of church and state, the non-establishment clause. She refused to privilege any right over another. And I mean, so she was, I think that was one of the bases for her dissent in the Hobby Lobby case. She thought that the court was protecting religious liberty to the nth degree, was the phrase that she used, at the cost of women's rights. But I thought, she did an interview with Jeff Rosen of the National Constitution Center just a couple of weeks after I interviewed her. And he asked her, in the context of the Me Too movement, certain excesses and suppression of due process in Title IX proceedings on campus. And he said she was quite critical of that from a due process perspective. And then he followed up and he said, well, but if it's a matter of balancing gender equality against due process of those who are accused of sexual assault. And she said, it's not a matter of either or, it's both. Everybody is entitled to due process, including those who are accused of sexual assault and sexual harassment.
Can I just say one thing about Hobby Lobby before we leave it totally? The one thing that she, and repeated this in the Minnesota Law Review in an interview, said in her dissent was, what if, this is on the issue of the First Amendment and establishment of religion, what if a husband what if they didn't agree with Title VII? The Hobby Lobby, would that mean that the company wouldn't have to go along with Title VII because it was against its religion? And I hate to say it, but People of Praise and Amy Coney Barrett raised that right smack dab when she became affiliated with, or is affiliated with, that organization, and scares the daylights out of me because of her religious affiliation.
Well, I mean,
which she does not hide, and it's,
well, I mean, undermining all kinds of laws with general applicability is part of the agenda of the Christian right. I think it's really interesting that one of the last votes that RBG had in the regular sitting of the Supreme Court was in a Title VII case in which she agreed that, again, this is Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, in which she was one of those who agreed, and I think you could see her fingerprints all over the decision, even though she didn't write it. It was written by, of all people, Neil Gorsuch, that because of sex also applied to LGBTQ individuals, including people being discriminated on the basis of their gender identity and their sexual orientation. And so I think that actually shows the broader reverberations of her commitment to equality in all kinds of realms. However, it's been just over a year since we lost Justice Ginsburg. So to my great regret, I want to close by asking each of you to think about how we come to terms with her loss, how we continue the work. Of course, you are both actively continuing the work, but how should those who admire the work that Justice Ginsburg did in her life now be understanding what lies ahead here? I mean, you mentioned Amy Coney Barrett. This is the person obviously who replaced Justice Ginsburg on the bench. So now that we've lost her, what next on the Supreme Court and how do we move forward? Nadine, do you want to start?
I would say, again, going back to the ACLU, which is the common theme here, although the Women's Rights Project is best known, and the ACLU itself probably is best known for litigation, that has never been the only strategy that the ACLU has used. And even within litigation, it's not only at the Supreme Court level. So if you find that, the Supreme Court becomes hostile, you don't give up. You look for another strategy. It might be litigating in state court systems. It might be lobbying for legislation. After all, that's what Ruth was advocating should have been done. That was another one of her critiques of Roe. You do it through grassroots lobbying. And so, you keep going. And she would have been the first one to say not to get discouraged. You have to take it step by step. And also, this is a motto of the ACLU that's attributed to Thomas Jefferson, but I think that's apocryphal. Eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. And one of the founders of the ACLU, Roger Baldwin, said, "No fight for civil liberties ever stays won." We've got wonderful foundations thanks to the great work that she and Brenda did, but we have to keep shoring up that foundation and building upon it further.
Well said. Brenda?
Yeah, let me go back for 1 minute, and then I'm going to say something else. I'll go back to when we were there in 1972 and lobbied successfully for Title IX, which, as you know, of the education amendments, which gave girls and women equal status, if I can put it that way, with boys and men in sports and in educational institutions. It was really an important piece of legislation, and I'm very proud to have had something to do with that. Now I want to answer the question of where are we in terms of, remember the 2017 march, Women's March, which blew me apart. I was so impressed by it. I was here in Los Angeles. There were 750,000 people here and in Washington and in New York each. 5.2 million people around the world, men and women, marched in the Women's March in response to Trump's election, but also saying in signs and posters and everything, the different issues that they cared about. And having looked at that, I got inspired, and I thought, you know what, this is like a wheel with spokes in it. And the spokes are equality for women, anti-racism, climate crisis, disability rights, immigrant rights. I mean, there are 12 different spokes that I've come up with, and have a wheel to show it in my new version of my book that's going to eventually be electronically published, because I came out 21 years ago. Not one of the boys, living life as a feminist. But what I'm saying is that
you should check out as soon as it's reissued.
Yeah, I'm writing the new last chapter because the last one is so outdated. But the fact of the matter is that it's really important to see all the different people that are fighting for their own rights. I don't think you can call yourself a feminist unless you believe in every single one of the issues that I mentioned there. You can be for, Black Lives Matter and not care about the climate. I doubt that. You can care about the climate and not care about Black Lives Matter, but you can't be a feminist and disagree with any of these issues. They're very, very important to all of us. So I just think that Ruth is an inspiration for a broad view of all different kinds of injustice and equality, and they all blur together. And I defy my feminist friends of 50 plus years ago to tell me that they have any problem with the way in which we have paved the way for people to have equality and therefore to branch out and care about issues that affect them and their neighbors and their relatives and people all over the world. So we really, I take a huge amount, I mean, I take for us a huge amount of credit for having paved the road for this. And Ruth is right there smack dab in the center front and always will be.
Right. And of course, part of the inspiration for the exhibition is the fact that the younger generation spontaneously erupted in admiration for RBG. And what we did try to do with the book was to put it into the broader context of the movement work, of the history, one individual with an incredible personal story, but also, and incredible professional work as we've been discussing here, but never acting alone. And we dedicated Notorious RBG to the women on whose shoulders we stand. So that is
you deserve a huge amount of credit for, I mean, personally, you for making Ruth into an icon. I mean, she was a leader in her own way. She was a leader among justices, as well as going all the way back to when she constituted, and with other women, 2% of her class at Harvard Law School. But to make her into a world famous icon, I really do hand you the credit, and I thank you profoundly.
My co-author Shauna was the one who called her Notorious RBG, but we together wanted to take it in a direction that would deepen people's engagement with it, that we could have the kind of conversations that we had tonight, that more people might be drawn in because they think, actually, I'm thinking, Nadine, about you talking about what RBG was wearing. I mean, she actually understood, she loved style, and she also understood visual iconography. And so when she was putting on her dissent collar, she was doing so for the world to pay attention, and the world did. When she was dissenting from the bench in Shelby County versus Holder, which is when she became the Notorious RBG, she was doing so because she wanted to get the public's attention after she had already lost the argument in the case. Which connects to what you say. Here the courts, the Supreme Court at least, may be lost for a generation. Of course, RBG was dissenting, so it wasn't great shakes while she was still on it. This is a very, very long campaign, but that's not the only forum for the work.
And in the past, great dissents have, over the course of time, been adopted as majority opinions, and I have absolutely no doubt that a subsequent generation on the court is going to reclaim some of her dissents and turn them into majority opinions.
Yes, as she said, dissents speak to a future age, and all of us continue to tell the story of what changed and what still needs to be changed. I wanted to really quickly, since you both had personal relationships with her, we only have a couple minutes left, but I'm just wondering, if you could share a personal memory that you when you think about her a year out, what comes to mind? And I'm going to give you a second. For me, I had the great honor of Justice Ginsburg officiating at my wedding. Hard to forget that one. And also the look on her face when I asked her if she would walk down with my younger, cute brother, and the delight in her eyes. And what she said, I think that would be nice.
That's great.
I'm just going to generalize that she was so incredibly generous, not only to me and legions of other women, professionals following in her footsteps, but also to my students. Every time I would ask her for seating at the Supreme Court, or if she could meet with them or speak at the law review banquet, she almost never said no. And it's just dazzling to me how she was able to be so productive and so hardworking and always be so generous. She was an amazing correspondent. I was amazed as I've gone over some of the letters that, she was the kind of person who would even thank you for a thank you letter. It just really a role model in terms of trying to be even 1/1000th of the kind and generous mentor that she was.
Absolutely. Brenda?
Well, I want to just go back to when she and I were celebrating, well, a lot of other people were celebrating the 50th anniversary of women graduating from Harvard Law School. And she told me that, let's see, I want to make sure I have that straight. Yes, that her granddaughter was going to be having her 3rd birthday the next day in the Supreme Court. And she was just going on to the court. I mean, she just loved being part of ritual, like celebrating the first class of women that graduated from Harvard Law School, and the fact that there were only 2% of women in her class, and she related to how all of us were feeling. And I think that ties in with after she was on the bench, and I visited her a number of times in her chambers after various hearings. She showed me the same-sex marriages that she had officiated at after that happened, and inspired me on a personal level when I was asked by my dear friends Lily Tomlin and Jane Wagner to marry them. And I took some Rilke poems and I read them, but she was just an inspiration, and she sent me letters that said so many things that I will cherish, and I do, and that's what I remember, the whole span of my life with her.
It's a gift to the world. And I know all of us feel personally like it was a gift to us. It's funny that you mentioned her granddaughter, because at least until very recently, she was a fellow in reproductive freedom at the ACLU. So the work continues. Thank you so much, Nadine and Brenda. It's been a wonderful evening. It's been a great honor to be part of this conversation. And thank you to all of the attendees. Notorious RBGs at the New York Historical Society for the next few months. Check it out if you can, and have a wonderful night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So unfortunately, we have run out of time. I want to thank Brenda Feigen, Nadine Strossen, and Irin Carmon for being with us today. Please sign up for our mailing list and follow us at nyhistory.org to get the latest on upcoming salons like this one. Irin Carmon and Shana Nishnik's book, Notorious RBG, The Life and Times of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, is now available online for purchase at our NY History store. Finally, New York Historical is currently open on Wednesday through Sunday. You can reserve your timed entry museum tickets on our website. We hope to see you on Central Park West to view Notorious RBG, as well as our many other exhibitions and offerings in women's history and beyond. Thank you again, and have a great night.